Welcome. Welcome Mr. Suter back to the fold. Would you like to say hi to everybody? They've dearly missed you, I'm sure.
I've not been gone. Just been sitting here silent.
So at least bowing to the greater intellect, as one might say. Anyhow, today's lesson, lesson 18, is quite a long one. We're going to cover the federal political reform, both the successes and the failures of the three progressive presidents, known as Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Now, what's really important to remember when we consider all of this stuff is that anytime you consider the impact of the progressives, and they do make quite an impact, it always has to be measured against the things that they don't do. And it's also really important to remember that all three of these presidents, regardless of what they do for the white, middle, and lower classes, preside over the worst period in race relations in American history. So just keep that in mind. Now, we'll start with Theodore Roosevelt. I think I'll kick off. I'm a big Roosevelt fan, not because he does a huge amount of stuff, but because in the context of the time, he actually pushes things forward more so than they'd ever been kicked down the hall, or kicks the can down the hallway further than it ever has been. Anyways, Roosevelt becomes commonly known as the first president to be associated with progressivism. Alan Brinkley calls him a champion of cautious, moderate change. But in the context of the turn of the century, having become president after the assassination of McKinley in 1902, Roosevelt is quite a profound transformation from the cautious, very much sort of conservative republicanism we've been used to. He wasn't out to revolutionize government, but really guarantee a balance, i.e., to curb the worst abuses of industrialization, to curb the worst abuses of the trust, while at the same time ensure that the party continues in effect by allowing the United States economy to expand and grow and flourish based on the foundations which had created the world's #1 industrial economy by 1900. Roosevelt's best known for perhaps the initiation of over 40 legal proceedings against monopolies, trusts, and corporations. So let's take a look at his achievements. We'll go into Roosevelt in a little bit greater detail in about 3 lessons time, but we're going to break down his achievements versus his failures, and these are probably the most important things we have to consider. Trust busting. He is really the first person to move against the trust. He doesn't necessarily want to destroy trusts in corporations, but rather distinguish between good and bad ones. He wants to help the good ones by stamping the latter, which, in his opinion, were ruining the opinion of American peoples towards a massive wealth generating thing. So his trust busting approach, some people said he was the first president to wield a big stick. And what they mean by wielding a big stick is that he was the first person able to use the power of the presidency, or rather willing to use the power of the presidency, as a tactic to curb the abuses of the Gilded Age. This was a pretty popular tactic. In fact, it made Theodore Roosevelt massively popular with the American citizens, and his re-election for what would be his first full term, but his re-election in 1904 proves that Theodore Roosevelt was massively successful. He wins one of the greatest electoral college margins in American history. All that said, the government never attempts to bust most of the country's trust. What he does do is bring a few well-publicized suits, like a 1902 case against the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad combination. He really did go after the railroads. The railroads were a hot-button issue, particularly amongst farmers, as you recall. And as a result, Roosevelt uses the majority of his trust-busting efforts directed towards railroads. There were railroads at this time who were monopolizing, obviously, transportation, but they were also giving free rides to companies, and then charging exorbitant prices to others. This was an attack on J.P. Morgan. Northern Securities was a holding company. It owned railroads all over the United States that went from the Pacific Oceans to the Great Lakes. And this deprived Western consumers of the benefits of the market in the East, because there were comparatively few railroad links east all the way to the far west. You had to rely on, by the turn of the century, 3 major transcontinental railroads, most of whom were owned by the Northern Securities Trust. And as such, unless you had or were in the pocket of the Northern Securities Trust, you paid exorbitant fares, which meant that the West was disproportionately disadvantaged versus the East. The Supreme Court, in one major victory, agreed with the government and ordered the Northern Securities Trust to be disbanded, which helped go a long way towards the equalization of fares.
So moving on to labour relations, that's the unions and the working classes. There are three broad arguments about this one. Number one, that Roosevelt actually didn't really care about trade unions, and when he did get involved, it was only once or twice to look like he's progressive and then didn't do much else. And there aren't actually many more examples beyond the one we're going to give you. The second one is that he is a champion of the worker, he loves the workers, and that's important to get the workers' votes, so Roosevelt didn't necessarily discourage that. That's probably not borne out by the evidence, by the limited extent to which he did get involved. Generally, the argument is that Roosevelt wants to shift the federal government from being completely on the side of the businesses against the workers, something which increasingly is leading to problems, challenges from the working classes, radicalism, but also loses a ton of votes if you do that while president, to a more neutral, arbeiting sort of approach or position. So they are the referee almost between two competing interests, and therefore they are neutral. The beauty of that is you don't quite annoy your rich voters, but also you don't quite annoy your poor voters by being seen as neutral in between-ish. In reality, you can argue that he still annoys them the rich by doing this, and doesn't quite get all the working classes on their side. Working classes still vote for Democrats overwhelmingly. So he is the first president, however, who does intervene in a labour dispute between the mine workers of the United Mine Workers and the mine owners, and does not automatically take the side of the employers. Now, this is a big deal, and actually loses a lot of support from certain rich members because of this position, because this is seen as the start of a slippery slope. In reality, he does not help the workers in and of themselves. What he does is he says, I am not going to send federal troops in to force the mine workers back to work. On top of that, because this industry, and because the strike is continuing and it's starting to harm both the federal government, both the economy, but also local regions, the federal government is going to come in and make a decision about who is right and what should be done. They forced the union and the coal industry, and he was making clear that he was forcing both, although the United Mine Workers really didn't mind being forced into arbitration, but he made it look like he's forcing them into it, because that way it looks like he's being neutral. When the miners refused to accept arbitration, Roosevelt threatened to dispatch federal troops to seize them. That is actually fairly unconstitutional as a threat, but they believed him and they gave in. And in the end, the deal that the federal government came up with was a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour day, which the miners followed. So you can say this is a massive success because he is first repositioning the federal government and he's helping the workers. I would say the first one, that Roosevelt has shifted what the federal government does from automatically in being involved in strikes to being more neutral, is a huge success. I think the mine workers he only does this once or twice, so not less. What in terms of how he affects actual individual workers is less important. The next area is similar. This is consumer regulation, i.e., when there are goods made, making sure the government regulates to make sure they're to a certain standard. Now, he does this officially for progressive reasons, although you could argue that he is throughout this thinking about politics. Now, the classic example are the meat packers. American meat had been increasingly denied imports, so it couldn't be sold to European countries because much of it was tainted. There wasn't many regulations, much of it was rotten or had things in it which weren't the animal that it was meant to be. This on top of Upton Sinclair, one of the muckrakers' book, The Jungle, which also came at the same time, which discouraged people from eating meat, but more than that, showed the abuse of particular Chicago Trust meatpacking industry, brought mass domestic support. So Roosevelt has an economic argument to challenge and change the meat processing industry to make it more acceptable, because they want to sell more meat and make more money for America, but also a political reason, because people increasingly were horrified by the incredibly poor hygiene and processes of the meat packers. So he passes the Meat Inspection Act, and meat shipped over state lines. And the important thing here is, if you pack the meat in Wisconsin and sell it in Wisconsin, you don't have to listen to federal government. That's the states' rights, 10th Amendment stuff. But if it's across state lines, which is the majority of meat in reality, a government can come in and inspect it. In reality, this looks impressive, but actually isn't a big deal, because you can inspect, but to enforce is something else. And what we'll find is enforcement of infractions, enforcement of abuses often comes and focuses on the smaller, weaker industries rather than the politically powerful robber baron-esque industries. So, for example, the Chicago Trust is not particularly badly affected by the Meat Inspection Act. Indeed, it is argued that they like the Meat Inspection Act because the smaller businesses, smaller competition, were more likely to fail this hygiene test because they're more likely to cut corners, but also they couldn't pay off and they couldn't lawyer up and argue against the federal inspectors as well as the big trusts. So in reality, the Meat Inspection Act looks impressive, but is actually a fairly political decision. He's done it for political reasons because it's popular. It's very limited. This is not every industry has this, and in reality, it's not something that crushes the power of the trusts and doesn't, although it leads to an improvement, it is not a remarkable improvement of meat processing.
I would say at best it costs a couple more pennies on the can for the production of a substandard meat product, because in order to get that government seal, they have to do a little bit more.
Yeah, very little bit.
Harms their profits to a small degree.
The similar example is the Food and Drug Act, where you cannot mislabel food and pharmaceuticals, particularly food, to sell by dates and what sort of animal it is. Again, you'll see that this is not a bad thing, but you also should hopefully notice these are fairly limited to certain areas. And what we find is both with the Meat Inspection and Pure Food and Drug Act, these are both areas where there was massive political scandals about abuses in these industries. So there's the political support to make changes. In consumer areas where there isn't political support or the big corporations are against it, we see less success on consumer regulation.
Okay, moving on to environmentalism. Roosevelt is also known as probably the first environmentalist president. That doesn't necessarily mean that he wanted to preserve the rest of the United States so people could have lovely walks in the woods. What that meant is, and you should probably note this down because it's not in either of the next two slides, Roosevelt's approach was known as multi-use conservationalism. He didn't want to close off the woods to lumberjacks. He didn't want to close off the rivers to fishermen, but he wanted to preserve it to the degree it was possible. So he's talking about sustainable use of natural resources. Basically, what had started to happen by the 20th century is the fact that Americans, with their massive expansion and unbridled capitalism, has effectively destroyed the nature of the United States. They had mined as much as they possibly could. They had cut down as many trees as they possibly wanted. They had moved to every corner of the American continent and tried to essentially pillage the natural resources for personal profit on an unprecedented scale. It is absolutely astonishing to consider that in America, a relatively new country founded only 130 years before, had cut down 1/4 of their trees by the turn of the century. Now, Roosevelt will move in combination with some quite popular conservationists. One was a guy named Pinochet, who founded an organization known as the Sierra Club, which is actually an important organization for conservation still working today. Roosevelt will be influenced by him and pass a few important acts. Now, here's a good example of multi-use conservationalism. Newlands Act of 1902. This is the paid for and the construction of dams and irrigation for the sort of arid western states to make the land out west more farmable. As a result, this would facilitate widespread settlement, land cultivation, and provide affordable electric power. In return, the profits made from irrigation, land settlement, and affordable electric power would be turned over to fund other conservation projects. So in a sense, it's a little bit in and out. So the Newlands Act is an interesting use of multi-use conservationalism, but it's an important first step forward because it guarantees that some lands, as a consequence of this, will be funded in order to remain pristine, if you will. In 1902, he'll also set aside 125 million hectares of land, a huge sum of land, as conservational areas. Some of these will establish the first national parks and so on and so forth across the United States. He sets up forest reserves where trees cannot be cut down, and water reserves where people cannot build factories on, as not to pollute the pristine water, to keep a supply of fresh water, and so on and so forth. Additional successes come in 1908. He'll issue a presidential proclamation establishing the Muir Woods National Monument just north of San Francisco. It's actually, ironically, where the United Nations Charter was signed and where they met to form the United Nations at the end of the Second World War. But the Muir Woods National Monument preserves redwoods, and it's really a sign that the American government will be active in the conservation project. He'll restrict private development on public lands, and this will save millions of acres at the turn of the century from developers who were more concerned at this particular time with logging than anything else. He establishes 5 national parks across 148 million acres of national forest, 23 national monuments during his 8 years, which of course establish a protected region around that national monument. He'll create the first wildlife refuge called Pelican Island in Florida, which will save a very delicate ecosystem around the Florida Keys. Now, one other quick point is we need to remember that with all of these successes, it would be unfair and perhaps ahistorical to say that Roosevelt was a shining success, because there are massive limits on what he did as a progressive president. And I turn this over to Mr. Souter.
So two very quick ones. We've mentioned the environmental regulation under Teddy Roosevelt. The first thing, the big one is, and a big specific example for your essays, is there are lots of case-by-case examples of where environmental regulation either doesn't happen or is reversed in the face of other concerns. So, for example, there was a big protest. There was a protest movement in 1913 as the residents of San Francisco saw that a nearby park, sort of part of the national park, the Hetchy Valley, was essentially had a massive hole dug in it to have a reservoir. And there's lots of other examples of this, particularly in areas of political power. So, for example, the national parks in the south, in Texas, or the federal land owned in Utah and sort of the southwest, was very often thrown away or given into oil interests or whatever interests which happen to be there. So while there is national parks made, there are many other candidates for national parks which are ignored because big money wants it, or some of those national parks are reversed. The other sort of bigger area of failure is trust busting. Now, while he does bust trust, it's important to realize that Roosevelt was not ideologically against trust as a concept, i.e. he did not want to crush every trust. He wanted to send a message, you could argue for shallow political reasons to get votes, or because he genuinely didn't like trust but didn't want to destroy the US economy at the same time, your choice, that trusts were bad and therefore he would bust an occasional trust. But in reality, the vast majority of trusts in the US do not get prosecuted. This is particularly the case when you look at the type of trusts. The examples of the trusts that are bust, for example, in securities, are actually quite minor trusts. The big, powerful trusts with actual connections in Washington, the meatpackers, for example, US Steel, which actually grows over this period, get completely left alone. So to some extent, yes, there is trust busting, but there's always this feeling that Roosevelt is either not really committed to trust busting as an idea, or that he's playing politics. He's doing a bit of trust busting because that's popular amongst the people, but he's avoiding actual powerful people such as JP Morgan, US Steel, meatpacking, the remnants of the Vanderbilt, although there's not much of it left at this point, companies, as well as some of the oil companies, although that has changed over time. Okay, so in reality, while there is some trust busting, it is very, very politically selective and therefore very limited.
Okay, one of the other limits has to do with what's known as the economic panic of 1907. This is very often known as the Roosevelt panic. And I want you to make note of two things. Number one, this panic was not as bad as it was perceived to be. However, it is an example that Roosevelt was not able to curb the abuses of the U.S. Banking industry. Okay, let me explain this in very slow layman's terms. Firstly, this panic was caused by an inability for banks to borrow money in times of financial crisis. There were across the United States many, many banks. Some banks were phenomenally rich, and if problems hit, they could, because they have lots and lots of money, weather the storm. There were banks that were less successful. In the United States this time, there is no central government deposit of money that can be lent to banks if they are in trouble. Today, there is. In England, we have the Bank of England, which provides this. In the United States, they have what's known as the Federal Reserve, which provides money in the time of financial crisis to bail out a bank. Now, since the Federal Reserve didn't exist in 1907, when banks encountered trouble, okay, which had nothing to do with Roosevelt, it was sort of the natural, let's say, process of deregulation in the markets meant that people made risky investments, and sometimes those investments didn't come out. Banks could not borrow money to keep them afloat. And as a result, the government, facing a massive crisis where banks would start to go out of business and people would lose their savings, okay, had to turn, within the absence of the Federal Reserve, to large financiers. And Roosevelt goes cap in hand to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, the famous financier, robber baron, who had owned the National Securities Trust, not someone who was a massive fan of Roosevelt. J.P. Morgan had to lend the government money to bail out the failing institutions that had prompted the recession. As a consequence of this, okay, Roosevelt had to promise Morgan that he would not pursue antitrust allegation against U.S. Steel. The whole thing about this, number one, is that Roosevelt, and as a president, didn't try to reform the banking system. The panic in that way was his. As a result, he had to go to a robber baron to borrow the money. And the robber baron made him promise that he would not input more progressive legislation in the form of an antitrust suit against the U.S. Steel Company, which he had recently purchased from Andrew Carnegie. Morgan, okay, effectively got away with creating one of the biggest trusts in the world, and he was completely untouchable by the President of the United States, a person who had made his bona fides by trying to bust the trust. So it's another example of Roosevelt perhaps not going very far, that cautious, moderate change. What's more important, and why I say it's not that bad, ultimately the panic doesn't last very long, and it will spur on further progressive legislation post-Roosevelt. However, the banks and the big business use the economic turmoil of the 1907 panic to launch a massive propaganda campaign against Roosevelt to try and scare people away from progressivism. A consequence of that is that it gets named, quote unquote, the Roosevelt panic. That's not given to them by historians, that's created by bankers. And that Roosevelt panic was widely blamed on the failures of Theodore Roosevelt. Even though Roosevelt could have done very little, and the fact that he did do very little also sort of gives him a degree of responsibility. The Roosevelt panic, even though it's a failure and shows that he did not live up to a lot of the desires of the progressive movement, wasn't necessarily that bad. And as of also too, I suppose, if you want to look at why it wasn't that bad, if you're looking for an evaluative point on this, generally speaking, in these types of crises, that people know where the bucks lie, and people were more concerned about J.P. Morgan's influence on government than they were with Roosevelt's fault. And he retained a huge amount of popularity before he eventually stepped down in 1908, as promised in his campaign pledge in the 1904 election. Now, we're going to move on to William Howard Taft, the successor, the handpicked number 2 of Roosevelt, another Republican.
So the classic historiography of Taft is that he is a failure in between two strong progressive presidents, Roosevelt being before, Wilson being afterwards. And to some extent, a more nuanced historiography points out that both Wilson and Roosevelt were less progressive as it may seem, for reasons that we've seen, but also that Taft wasn't as bad as he perhaps looked. He was certainly less willing to be dynamic, that means get involved, do stuff actively, by personality than Roosevelt, but most people were. He was also probably more a natural Republican conservative in instinct, if not politics. However, he did fundamentally understand that the progressive movement was a political movement, it was a platform he was focusing on, and so he does make an effort, but it never seems to have his real heart behind it, as we shall see with, say, Wilson. So he becomes the next president, but there are a number of failures. The most glaring, and one that he's chided most for, is the Payne-Aldrich tariff. If you remember, progressives do not like the tariff for all the reasons that we've explained, but problem is Republicans do like the tariff because they're Republicans. So we've got this sort of issue where he's a Republican progressive and he's got two camps. One wants the complete ending of the tariff. One understands politically one needs to deal with the tariff, but still quite likes it. And progressive expect, with a tariff reform, that the tariffs will at least go down. They want a lower tariff to increase imports. That means more competition, which means that both the trust stranglehold is reduced, but also the poor will get cheaper goods in from other countries. Okay, Roosevelt had generally put this issue off, knowing that it was a deeply problematic political issue to get across. So therefore, this lands in Taft's lap. Now, Taft pushes this through legislature, but it's important to remember that any law is Congress's action. The Congress is the only one who can really pass laws. Taft can suggest laws, he can introduce laws through a congressman, so he writes it and gives it to a congressman to give in. But ultimately, it's up to Congress. And in reality, Congress has emotional Republicans who are not quite as progressive as Taft, plus Democrats who are just naturally more conservative, plus like seeing Taft have a bad time. So in what happens is there's not a complete reversal, but certain areas of industry which benefit individual senators. So the senator from Wisconsin wants to make sure that the dairy industry is protected because there's a lot of dairy over there, get improved. So basically, in order to get a reduction in tariffs, certain industries of important senators have to be given an increase in tariff to buy them off. We call this pork barrel politics or horse trading. So what ends up happening is this tariff law reduces some tariffs in certain areas, but also increases many tariffs, some hugely, when they've needed to buy off the senator from Wisconsin, for example. And this, as you can imagine, massively appalls most progressives who are expecting this tariff reduction. And even though there was some tariff reductions, they cannot help but look at the large amount of tariff increases at the same time.
The second major failure, and this is something that brings Roosevelt back into politics against Taft, and Roosevelt had basically chosen Taft as a successor and thought he was the person to, effectively carry the torch into the future. In the end, their relationship ruptures, and Roosevelt chooses to run against Taft in 1912 by creating his own party, which he calls a Progressive Party, which runs in one election and doesn't win, but neither does Taft. Anyways, long story short is this, okay? Taft appoints a corporate lawyer, a man named Bollinger. Bollinger is made Secretary of the Interior. Secretary of the Interior is the person responsible for maintaining the conservation areas that Theodore Roosevelt had so passionately protected. James R. Garfield was Roosevelt's man. He's replaced by Bollinger. And Bollinger goes in very short order and starts returning millions upon millions of acres of natural forest reserves that had been set aside to Roosevelt back into the public domain to be logged, to be cut down, to be mined, basically to be exploited for monetary purposes. Roosevelt, it was believed by Bollinger, had overstepped his authority and he kept too much of the land of America out of the hands of the people. Of course, this absolutely infuriates Roosevelt, who's watching from the sidelines, but it also infuriates a man named Gifford Pinchot. And I had mentioned Pinchot as the founder of the Sierra Club. He had been made head of the Forest Service as well by President Roosevelt, and he was responsible for protecting physically these natural forests. Well, Pinchot accuses Bollinger of colluding with big business, mining and lumber companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's lots of evidence that Pinchot's easily able to find that Bollinger was taking huge $1 million payouts from these companies in return for deregulating these areas. Now, determined to prevail and wanting to out Bollinger, okay, Pinchot leaks the story to the press, and he calls for a congressional investigation of Bollinger. Taft is infuriated by Pinchot's boldness, fires him in response, and the uproar creates a massive political scandal. This scandal is bad. It brings Taft's reputation down. Roosevelt splits publicly with Taft. He campaigns against Taft. He starts his own political party, willing to destroy and wanting to destroy the presidency of Taft, the man he had chosen to sort of be his natural next successor. 2 years after the controversy in 1912, there will be a very famous election, which is known as the Bull Moose election. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later lessons, which we'll see three interesting progressives technically run against each other. You'll have Taft, Roosevelt running for his own party, and the Democrats throwing up Woodrow Wilson. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson wins, but Roosevelt, in many cases, destroys the presidency of Taft. And it all has to do with the Bollinger-Pinchot controversy. Now, let's not throw Taft out with the bathwater. Like that, it's clever, right? It's the baby with the bathwater. No, I said Taft. Okay, and let's talk about some of the successes of Taft, because he did have some. And more particularly, and more acutely, his largest success had to do with trust busting. He was probably one of the most successive of the progressive presidents in using the powers of the federal government to attack the trusts. He took some of the most powerful corporations in the American economy to court. Okay? Roosevelt, for instance, had deemed Rockefeller's Standard Oil a good trust. The Taft administration convinced the Supreme Court that Standard Oil was in fact a bad trust and in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Rockefeller's monopoly then was broken up after 30 or 40 years of dominating almost the entire oil industry. Taft has one of the biggest companies in the world broken up, okay, into smaller companies, one for marketing, one for refining, one for producing petroleum. One of the interesting consequences of that is you probably have purchased petrol from a Standard Oil gas station. They're still a massive company, but you didn't know that while stopping at an Esso station, okay, for example, or going to a Gulf station as another example, or a Texaco station, you are actually buying oil from 3 broken up bits of Standard Oil. So there's a lasting legacy of Taft that you meet when you fill up at the pump almost every day. A couple other points. Under Taft, he strengthens the Interstate Commerce Act, which prevents or is meant to prevent trusts from going across state lines. He creates a Department of Labor, which is meant to look after the interests of workers and clamp down on poor and horrible working conditions. This was especially prominent after what's known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City, something we'll talk about a little bit later on in a number of different contexts. And the government will also prevail in a suit against the American Tobacco Company, which had been formed in the South and led basically a complete dominance of the tobacco industry at a time when everybody smoked cigarettes. This was a huge, huge, huge business. And basically, the American tobacco industry came to dominate almost 100% of the manufactured cigarettes in the United States. And as a consequence, smaller producers had a hard time. Farmers weren't getting a lot of money for their tobacco crops. And he's able to successfully break this trust's ability to use cutthroat pricing policies in order to undercut their competitors and bankrupt smaller businesses. So he has some massive success. And Taft has really actually earned, in many cases, the nickname the Trust Buster. Another success of Taft, and it's important to know, was the income tax. Up to this point, the chief way that Americans made, or the American government got money, was through the tariff. Taft is responsible for passing one of the first major constitutional amendments of the Progressive era, the 16th Amendment, which is ratified in 1913. It authorized Congress to enact a graduated income tax. Okay, it modernized the rapidly expanding federal government, provides it with a stable source of revenue because tariffs tend to be a little bit unstable and are basically due, on good years in the world economy, you have lots of money. Bad years, you have less money. This gives the government a stable source of revenue. Okay, the progressive had always pushed for a lower tariff to encourage a more open competition in the marketplace, and to do this, in order to reduce the tariff, the government first had to put in the income tax. Okay. Um, in 1894, Congress tried to pass another income tax, but the Supreme Court rejected it. So from the civil, literally from almost the end of the Civil War up until the 16th Amendment in 1913, there was no income tax whatsoever. However, in 1913, Taft got it passed. A constitutional amendment but was necessary to pass it. It was passed in 1912 and ratified by Congress. And in fact, to pass a constitutional amendment, you need every state to vote on it, and every state, or the majority of states, support the implementation of a federal income tax. Now, important to note, this is not a massive income tax. In fact, many, many, many rich people paid almost no tax at all, but it was a start. And it was the start of a little bit of a balancing, I suppose, in the United States economy. Now, that's Taft. We're going to move on very quickly to Woodrow Wilson. And as I said, in later lessons, we'll look at each of these presidents in a little bit more detail, evaluating them individually. But right now, I'm basically outlining the success and the failure. Now, a couple important points about Woodrow Wilson. Background: he's only the second Democrat to become president since the end of the Civil War. He was a massive idealist. Okay, and if you remember studying, or if you study the Treaty of Versailles, his 14 points were very much based on his ideals. He wanted to wage war, in his opinion, and he talked about this on campaign, on the triple wall of privilege. He hated the tariff, he hated the bank, and he hated the trust. Other important thing to know, even though he sort of earned his political stripes as governor of New Jersey, a sort of a northern state, he was born and raised in the South. He was sympathetic to the cause of the South in the Civil War. And Woodrow Wilson is not a friend of black people. That said, what are his successes? Moving forward very quickly, we come to tariff reform and the income tax. Okay, To make amends for the disappointing Payne-Aldrich tariff, the one that Mr. Souter had talked about, and Taft's inability to lower the tariff, Wilson pushed through what's known as the Underwood Tariff after his inauguration in 1913. It reduced import duties, i.e. tariffs, more substantially than anything had before, which allowed more foreign competition in the marketplace. Of course, big business hated it, but progressives had hoped that such competition would undermine the power of domestic monopolies and really start to break up the trusts. The reduced tariff meant that the government would be receiving less in income from duties, so Congress has to, under Wilson, pick up on the income tax passed under Taft and ensure it got through. Okay, the income tax, even though it's put forward by Taft, is ratified under Wilson. Okay, it applies a 1% levy to married couples and corporations that earn over $4,000 a year, and to single people who made over $3,000 a year. Marginal tax rates increased for wealthier citizens, maxing out at 6%. I mean, this is pathetically small, but it's something. At least it's something. And it's the first time in American history we have had to tax anything of the substantial. What's really important to note that 95% of American people earning less than $900 a year, which is not very much money, pay no income tax at all. So even the wealthy pay taxes at rates that seem extraordinarily low compared to today. That said, that didn't necessarily mean that they liked it. That didn't necessarily mean that it wasn't a success for the Wilson and Taft governments in getting it through. Another major success for Woodrow Wilson is the direct election of senators. One of the things that you recall when we talked about the corruption of the boss system and the party system in the United States was the fact that senators were not elected. There are two levels of the legislative branch of Congress. Of course, there's the House of Representatives. Each state gets members in the House of Representatives based on how many people in their states. The second house, to prevent tyranny of the majority, i.e. to prevent larger states from having such a sway over smaller ones, is that every bill needs to go through both the House and then into the Senate. The Senate is made up of equal representation from each of the states of 2 senators. Okay, so each state gets only 2 senators, regardless if you're the tiniest state like Vermont or you're the biggest state like Texas. You get the same amount of senators. Under the original terms of the Constitution, senators weren't elected. Okay. Instead, they were selected by the state legislatures, and of course, this meant that this was sort of it led to corruption. Political machines and party bosses manipulated Senate elections. Ambitious individuals literally bought seats in the Senate by bribing state legislatures. And of course, this was the easiest way, especially if you had money, for a corporation to get corporate-friendly people in the Senate. And then, of course, the Senate, if they vote against what goes through the House, can block just about any bill, be it something that the president wants to do or something that the House wants to do. Wilson is successful in getting the 17th Amendment, a key tenet of the progressive movement, passed, which ends this system. It allows for the direct election of U.S. senators by a popular vote, and every couple years, 1/3 of the senators face re-election. Then they sit for a 6-year period. Another success of Woodrow Wilson has to do with banking regulation. Okay. Wilson, and I'll talk about New Freedom and New Nationalism a little bit later, but let's just get down to the brass tacks of this. Wilson will pass regulation. So rather than aggressively trust busting, he'll advocate banking reforms. Okay, this will increase government oversight and government role in the supervision of the economy. One of the things we have to understand is before the progressive period, the government played very little role. Maybe in some cases they got involved. But by the end of the progressive era, both the size and the scope and the reach of the federal government into American life is quite profound. In 1913, the government will set up the Federal Reserve. This was something that was desperately needed to prevent the Panic of 1907. It was desperately needed because the Panic of 1907 led people like J.P. Morgan from effectively bankrolling the U.S. government and bribing Roosevelt. With this in mind, Wilson passes the Federal Reserve Act. It sets up 12 regional banks. This will issue currency. They'll be able to prop up unstable banks in danger of failing. It sets an interest rate, which all banks have to follow. So in other words, some banks would charge humongous interest rates, others less so. The Federal Reserve will set the national interest rate, which all banks have to peg against, which gets away from abusive lending practices. With this new system in place, okay, progressives had hoped to prevent future crisis and panic such as what happened in 1907. And of course, this was incredibly successful and was tested immediately during the First World War, as the United States banking system does hit a blip, especially when the United States has to borrow quite a lot in order to finance its participation from 1917 into 1918 in the First World War. Another success of Wilson, and you're probably already coming to the conclusion that Wilson is infinitely more successful than his predecessors, and you would probably be right by that, but it also has to put it in context in the fact that the predecessors in many ways laid the groundwork for Wilson's success. If Wilson come to power when Roosevelt did in 1902, there's no way he would have had this success. It would have taken the sort of the work of Roosevelt and Taft to sort of prepare the ground, if you will. Wilson was very much able to sort of step in at this point and make things better. Now, Wilson starts to attack the trust, not perhaps as hard as Taft, but he does. Okay. In 1914, Congress under Wilson will pass the Clayton Act, which establishes what's known as the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, something that's still in very effective use today. This will strengthen the powers of the Sherman Antitrust Act and increase the list of business practices that were deemed illegal or objectionable. It attacks the holding company, which is another form of trust. It's another way of hiding the true ownership, which gets around things like the Interstate Commerce Act. The Clayton exempted labor unions from antitrust laws. Okay, labor unions had been considered a form of collusion. There's an example of a hat maker company in Danbury, Connecticut, that goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that a union couldn't be formed by the hat makers of Danbury, Connecticut, because the fact that the workers were colluding and working together against the owners was a form of a trust. And it said that this cannot be interpreted as a form of a trust, which means that workers' unions and trade unions now have the ability to fight harder for increases in pay, increases in workers' benefit, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and it also prevents courts from issuing injunctions, which are laws or orders which prevent people from going on strike for better wages, better working conditions, etc. The FTC also regulated businesses. It would notify them in advance if their actions in this case would be considered or could be considered by the government as a form of price fixing. They might be deemed unfair or objectionable, etc., etc. Therefore, companies could change before the government clamped down on them. Okay, this was a pretty substantial boost in the government's ability to regulate business. Many businesses welcomed it, along with the Federal Reserve Act, as a means of stabilizing the economy. And many also accepted, and you may wonder why business is able to sort of to make this. Basically, by the time World War I starts, actually in the 1912 election, you have four parties running. You have the socialist candidate Eugene Debs running as a socialist candidate, and many Americans started to feel that the progressive movement was erring towards socialism. Not only that, there were actual socialists about, especially in the form of trade unions. And businesses basically rationalize that we've got to give in somewhere. And if we give in to this and we don't complain too loudly about this, at least it will calm down the demand for communism, which they would consider much, much more scary. Another success of Wilson is in workers' rights, and this is really the last major success of the Wilsonian government. They passed some pretty important legislation which guarantee rights for workers, and these are important steps forward, if you will. Number one, the Workingmen's Compensation Act. It gave assistance to federal civil service employees during periods of disability. You get a disease, cancer, you have a heart attack. You need a period of time of recovery. Before this act, if you worked for the federal government, at least, a lot of other people in other companies were still in trouble. There wasn't the mandate for this nationwide, but certainly if you worked for the federal government would sort of bridge your salary. They would ensure that you didn't, lose your house and all of your possessions due to foreclosure, due to an unforeseen medical issue. Okay, the Keating-Owen Act of 1916. This is important because it restricts child labor. I will talk about this in later lessons as well. On products that flow into interstate commerce. Okay, this will actually be invalidated by the Supreme Court later on, but again, it's an important step forward in restricting child labor. And then the Adamson Act in 1916 will establish an 8-hour day for rail safety for all railway workers. One other important point, he's pretty progressive in terms of changing the dynamic of the Supreme Court. He puts the first non-Christian on the Supreme Court by nominating Louis D. Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Brandeis is the first Jewish person nominated to the Supreme Court. Brandeis will be a big campaigner for things like the Keating-Owen Act. He'll fight against child labor. Brandeis will support women's suffrage, amongst other things, and will establish Brandeis University, one of the top universities in the eastern United States. Anyhow, Wilson will nominate Brandeis to the Supreme Court. It's also important to note that this sort of broad, multifaceted, progressive agenda isn't complete. There are a huge amount of things that need to change. We'll talk about some of the other successes and failures that come on. In fact, I'm going to talk about the failures in just a second. But when you look at Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt, and you're evaluating overall the progressive achievements, it is not a fundamental social transformation that some of the progressives have sought, but it goes a good bit further than anything that had come previously. So moving near the end, and I promise, we're going to look at two of the failures of Wilson, okay? The first failure is trusts, okay? He did help regulate trusts. However, he did not destroy monopolies. Wilson passes things like the Clayton Act. Just talked about it a couple slides ago. However, by the time it gets through court, many of the harsher provisions on trusts in the Act are diluted. In other words, as a bill goes through Congress, people can change it and amend it to make it more palatable to vote on. And by the time the Clayton Act comes out, it's not as hard as a lot of progressives would like it to have been. Clayton was supposed to sort of embody the Wilson promise of added labor protections and workers' rights. But when it gets through Congress, it's pretty watered down. Americans are effectively left with the impression that the president had passed the necessary reforms without realizing that these reforms had been compromised before they can be implemented. Once businessmen and others fully understood the potential for deception, they took advantage of it. They hid themselves in progressive language and used progressivism against itself. In other words, they had said, oh yeah, we'll accept this diluted Clayton Act, and then when people called for further reform, they said, well, we've already given you tons of reform, stop crying. And this sort of diluted the power of the progressive agenda. Because Wilson doesn't go far enough in regards to this, by the time the 1920s roll on, corporations are basically doing whatever they want. And this will have disastrous consequences. Had the progressive truly been successful, you probably don't have the Great Depression. But as a result, Wilson doesn't fight as hard as perhaps his predecessor Taft, and as a result, are the abuses of the trusts and corporations curbed? Not really. Not that much. And lastly, Wilson and minorities. And this is a really important point to hang on to. Okay. During Wilson and during the progressive era, progress for minorities was non-existent, in many cases worse. Wilson was born in the South. He was born in Virginia. He was raised a Southerner. Wilson will allow the reintroduction of segregation in federal government agencies, a crime against civil rights. And he'll preside over one of the worst periods in race relations in American history. Discrimination against blacks in Washington predated the Wilson administration, of course, but Wilson and his staff oversaw the removal of thousands of black civil service officials, and they perpetuated a nationwide trend in segregated federal employment. Under Wilson, the number of black congressmen, which had been in the dozens, goes down to one. Wilson also refused to support female suffrage until ultimately he capitulated due to public pressure and the need for women to work in war industries, and as a consequence of this, he had to give in to female suffrage. Wilson was no massive friend of the suffrage movement, but he's an opportunist, realizing he can monopolize women's labor very cheaply during the First World War in return for giving them the vote. And as a consequence of that, Wilson's era in terms of minorities is much maligned, and he does deserve some harsh criticism. Never mind his high-minded idealism. He is very much of the progressive ilk. He's white. He's obviously upper class, but it is a middle class movement. And as a result, those who get left behind are those people who don't necessarily fit that. So a little bit of a long lesson, but